well known, I would say, in terms of the media circles. He's the chief economist for Aviva Ireland, and no doubt will be giving us a perspective very much based on his commentary around how he sees the economy taking place going forward post-COVID in Ireland, and the implications of that, I suppose, for this big picture society discussion we're having this morning. And then finally, we will have Dr. Shana Cohen, who is the director of Task, an independent think tank that's very concerned with social change. And Shana will be drawing on some of their research that they have conducted in Task, and drawing on other research internationally to inform our debate and our discussion. So a very interesting, diverse lineup I think we have for this morning. Again, I'd really encourage you to make comments, ask questions, query, contest as you see fit, anything that you hear this morning, and then we will be able to take that up in the debates later on this morning. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to our first speaker, Kitty Holland, Social Affairs Correspondent for the Irish Times, to provide her first 10-minute input. Thank you, Kitty.
Hello, can you see me, hear me? I hope you can. Right, okay, well, I'm going to start. I'm just going to hope you can, you can all hear me. Right, okay, so as I was introduced, I'm Kitty Holland. I'm Social Affairs Correspondent with the Irish Times. And so I'm going to look at this issue from, I suppose, a journalistic point of view, and from what I see covering the sector, and particularly over the last few months. And I suppose what's really shone through for me over the last few months of the crisis is how crucially important the work is that the community and voluntary sector do. And how really it's the public service end of it. I sometimes think the term charitable sector or voluntary sector actually kind of demeans the sector and gives it less of a status than it should, because really, as we've seen so strikingly during the last few months, the crucial sector, the crucial public service that is done. And I was just looking through this morning some of the issues that I've covered, and this is just a small snapshot, but from organisations supporting LGBT young people, and the stress and suicidality that LGBT young people in particular have been feeling isolated, unable to get out to be with their peers, sometimes experiencing bullying and isolation in their own home communities, and how the huge number of calls that have been coming into the helplines. How important that work is in terms of just people surviving, I suppose, and getting through this. Again, as a matter of survival, the Women's Aid brought out a survey there a few weeks ago saying that they'd had a 40% increase in calls over the last few months. Again, I would say that they're providing an absolutely crucial service to women in domestic violence situations. That is not being provided, frankly, by the state alone, again, which looks after older people, has been running a helpline for older people through this crisis, obviously funded very much by the state, but it's been the organisation doing the work. And it has talked about, again, a rise in suicidality, isolation, loneliness. And they've been doing really crucial work in reaching out to older people, phoning older people themselves, and making sure they get the services that they need and they're not so isolated. Another piece I did was about the demand for free food banks, Meals on Wheels, doubling during the pandemic. Again, I would say a matter of survival being whether those services are happening or not. Another service I was at was the Mendicity Institution down on the Quays in Dublin, which was what I think actually the only homeless service still providing hot meals that people could sit down to during the pandemic, as most obviously had to close and were providing takeaway meals. And again, an absolutely crucial service. And what they were finding was that the state run homeless services, which find beds for people who are homeless. on a night-by-night basis were stopping admitting newly homeless people into accommodation, or into homeless accommodation or emergency accommodation, and they were stepping in with things like sleeping bags, and a lot of their people who would come to them don't speak English. There would be Eastern European men who would be really, really stuck trying to navigate the system. Again, a really, really crucial service. And again, I would say a matter of life and death for some of these people. And I suppose what really, really shines through for me during all this is the fact that these services are doing work that is not being by anyone else. That they are providing absolutely crucial public services. And again, I sometimes think the name charity actually kind of diminishes their role and makes it seem like a do-goody organisation that's, you know, almost a hobby for people. These are really, really crucial services. And I do sometimes think that there's a sort of public relations issue maybe there to look at in terms of the word charity and voluntary sector, but that's possibly for another day. And I suppose the context then in which all this is happening is this crisis. And I think we're at a really pivotal moment now as we emerge from this crisis in terms of how the role of the sector is argued for, is championed, is publicised. And there's I suppose, a moment happening now, and some might disagree with me on, you know, whether we're going to go back to business as usual or not, whether we're going to go back to a society being built by people who prioritise wealth building, the economy, whether there should be austerity, you know, what kind of measures are going to be taken to rebuild the economy coming out of this, and who's going to pay for that, and who's going to benefit from that. And I would also say that there's more going on perhaps than just the coronavirus, and I think that's to the sector's advantage. There's definitely a groundswell, I think, happening around other issues like the climate change, the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, where equality and human rights and those kind of issues are really coming to the fore. And we really see now that people are not tolerating things like racism anymore. It's just not, you know, it's just not tolerable. People like women aren't going to accept sexism and harassment. Hello? Sorry, I thought I heard someone coming through there. And so there is a context going on that is more than just the coronavirus. There is I really do feel it's a tangible shift going on in across the globe. I mean, this is going on from Seattle to Minneapolis to South Africa to Palestine to, you know, across the road. We saw protests of Black Lives Matter happening in Syria. So there is a moment going on in society at the moment, which, if we choose to grab it and make it and marshal our arguments, or marshal the arguments in favour of equality, I think it's an opportunity for the sector to argue for how important it is. And I think it's up to the sector it's up to the sector to frame those arguments and to put forward how crucially important they are. And I think they're not pushing at an open door really in terms of the politics and the environment in which all that's happening. And I'll leave that there. I find that into a bit of a vacuum, so I hope that all sounds okay.
Great, thank you. That was fantastic. And I'm conscious there is a bit of feedback, so possibly just remind people to mute their mics, please. And that'll help us, I think, with just a little bit of feedback there. But you did extremely well despite the sneeze. I just want to try and maybe just take out maybe couple or one or two sentences, just what you said, just to kind of wrap it up there. I suppose what I got out of that was essentially we have a context of recent very high profile activity that the C&V sector has engaged in that I think most people would recognise, as you have said, was crucial, was impressive, and perhaps there is an opportunity coming from that to make it something more permanent and more recognisable as a feature of Irish society, instead of something perhaps that was just seen as, you know, required in a moment of desperation. Because, as you say, a lot of these issues continue on irrespective of COVID. So is there an opportunity for the C&V sector to take forward arguments for a better position within Irish society, a more, I suppose, sustainable position in particular in Irish society, and voice their views at the political table. So I'm gonna close on that. I think that's been a very useful starting point for us, getting us thinking about the services, what they're doing, how well they've done, I suppose. But really, the point really is there an opportunity for change here for the sector as a result of that? Thanks a million, Kitty. I'm now going to move on to Jim Power, as who I said is the Chief Economist for Aviva Ireland. So I'm just going to welcome Jim and ask him to start with his 10-minute input.
Okay, Inez, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I just want to, I suppose, take up on a few economic-y type matters over the next 10 minutes. What we've seen, obviously, since the beginning of March, from an economic perspective, has been truly without precedent. You know, never before have we seen large swathes of our economy effectively shut down. And that makes it different than any other recession we've ever seen in this country when, you know, the economy didn't disappear, wasn't shut down. So it's been absolutely dramatic. And I never believed I would end up sort of commenting on the source of statistics and the magnitude of the statistics that I am currently commenting on. So it's a pretty dramatic shock to the economy. And I suppose if there is a consolation out of all of this is that we are not alone. This is a global phenomenon. You know, the International Monetary Fund has described this as potentially the sharpest economic slowdown since the 1920s. So a pretty dramatic economic backdrop for everything else that's happening at the moment. And we've had a lot of debate over the last month in this country and elsewhere about the need to open up the economy to get things flowing again. But there is an incredibly difficult balancing act going on at the moment between preserving the health of the economy and preserving the health of the nation. And I suppose on one side of that debate, you have economic and business interests. On the other side, you have the health interests. And the problem, of course, is that both sides have a lot of right on their side, and achieving some sort of balance between the two is incredibly important, but it is also incredibly difficult. And every country in the world is finding that. We see what's happening in Germany and northern Greece, in about 21 states of the United States at the moment, where we're starting to see an upsurge in cases again. So it just shows the very, very delicate and difficult balancing act, trying to restore the health of the economy while at the same time trying to preserve the health of the nation. There was a mention made by two previous speakers about this whole debate about society and economy. And I often think that this whole debate and argument is described in a very binary fashion. This is not binary. I mean, society and economy are both incredibly important. And economists are very frequently accused of being obsessed with economy, having no interest in society. I would dispute that, certainly from a personal perspective. But I think, to me, the bottom line is that unless you have a functioning economy, you will not generate the resources to create a functioning society. So I think one of the basic building blocks is to build an economy that generates the resources that will then be utilized to create a society. So you cannot have one without the other. So people who believe that economists are obsessed with the economy argument, I think, are missing the point. As I say, this is not a binary argument. You need an economy to create a functioning society. Of course, the big economic question is, you know, how you actually allocate the resources that the economy generates to achieve the best possible outcome. Lots of challenges coming out of COVID-19, and I suppose a lot of these challenges actually exacerbate pressures that were already in the system. The implications for the public finances are pretty dramatic. You know, we saw in the year to May The deficit was 6 billion higher than the same period last year. And the story is going to be worse when we get the June data, because we've seen massive increase in expenditure on social protection, on health particularly. And at the same time, we've seen a sharp decline in some elements of the tax revenues. So serious implications for the public finances. And I think we will be facing into an environment where over the next couple of years at least, Ireland will have very significant budget deficits. And the question is, I suppose, how we deal with those deficits. And I'll get to that in a second. I think another outcome from the current crisis is that, in my view, it is going to exacerbate the whole inequality situation here in this country and indeed around the world, because those who have been most adversely affected by COVID-19 and the economic shock are typically those in relatively low paid jobs with relatively low levels of skills, whereas the upper echelons of the labour market, at least in terms of earning and so on, have been largely unscathed by what's going on at the moment. So I think we are definitely left with the spectre of increased inequality. And indeed, you know, the legacy of unemployment we will be left with over the next couple of years will definitely be targeted on lower income and lower skilled workers. So that's obviously a problem. There's been a lot of talk about the community spirit that COVID-19 has generated. I'm afraid I'd be a little bit cynical about that. I think we've seen community spirit, but we've always had an element of community spirit. But we also have always had an element of society that has no interest in community spirit. So I don't see COVID-19 changing very much. I think human nature is what it is. People will continue to behave well or not so well. That's always been the way. I believe will always be the way. In terms of dealing with the public finance crisis that this is giving rise to, I would have that there's an assumption being made out there at the moment, and I think Kitty probably assumed that as well in her observations earlier, that this will be followed by austerity. It cannot be followed by austerity. There is no way over the next couple of years we can or should accept higher taxes, cuts in public spending to restore the public finances. We've got to try and get the economy growing as quickly as possible to generate the resources necessary, number one, to feed public services. Number two, you know, growth will eventually reduce the deficit automatically. So austerity cannot be considered. I think a few things that we will need to think about coming out of this, and I suppose these issues were always there, COVID-19 has probably highlighted. One is there does need to be a much greater focus on the quality of life, because the whole debate really over the years has been based on the quantity of economic activity. The quality of that economic activity is rarely questioned. So, you know, I think in the world of economics, there is increasing focus on quality of life as a metric that's worth measuring. And thankfully, although I don't believe it, but thankfully within the programme for government, you know, there is a commitment to try and develop some metrics around quality of life. I welcome that. Secondly, I think a debate that needs to start is the whole question about a universal basic income. And number one, the cost of that. Number two, the benefits that it would give rise to. So I think that's a debate that does need to start, regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with it. I think it's a very important debate that needs to be had. And I think a third issue focused very much on the audience here this morning is the funding structure of your sectors, because fundraising has been very, very seriously undermined over the last few months because of COVID-19. Every May, I do the Dublin Mountain Way for Barrettstown. That was cancelled, due to be held in September. I hope it will be, but I wouldn't be confident about it. I was registered to do the Dublin City Marathon in October for Barrettstown again, and that's obviously being cancelled now. I use personal examples there, but I think, you know, we've seen so much fundraising for the charity sector being cancelled because of COVID-19. So serious funding issues.
Okay, I think we may have lost Jim, or else he was actually at
Okay, can you hear me again?
Oh, we can.
Okay, I have no idea what happened there. Apologies. I was just about to wrap up anyway, as my 10 minutes is up. But I think that there is an assumption here that we do not spend enough money on public services. In the last couple of days, Eurostat has released a lot of data comparing Ireland's expenditure in a number of areas with our peer countries in the European Union. And areas like social protection, health, etc. You know, Ireland is well up there in the European league table if you measure it properly as a percentage of gross national income rather than GDP, which is a nonsense in an Irish context. One area where we certainly fall down dramatically is in aid-related social expenditure. We're way behind our European peers in that regard. But generally, across public services, the level of expenditure we engage in is well up there with our European peers. I think one of the problems we have is the structures that are in place for delivering public services, because we've seen a massive investment in the health service over the last 15 years, yet that has not translated into a commensurate improvement in the quality of services. So I would love to see out of all of this, in an environment of much changed public finances and fiscal situation, that there's a much greater focus on the structures of the public sector needed to deliver public services. I'll leave it there. Probably covered way too many issues, but just to give you some perspective on where I see the world at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. You're bang on the 10 minutes, in fairness to you. That was very interesting. And I suppose a couple of questions I think we could leave our audience with. You've certainly identified the challenges. And if one of those is related to the funding structure and the sustainability of the sector, if we're hoping it's going to be stronger in the future, and we're already aware that there's going to be this huge funding issue, what do we do about that? Maybe some of the participants today would have some comments in relation to that. And I suppose my only kind of observation on what you were saying is the connection between that quality of life indicator point and your final point about the quality of how we feel our public services are delivering for us as citizens, because they do seem rather connected. And I am aware that prior to the draft programme for government, one of our government departments was actually in train with looking at these quality indicators, because it was actually advised by the OECD in a recent review that it is something we should be doing. So I'd be slightly more hopeful than maybe you are there that actually may come to pass, and I hope it does. So thank you very much, Jim. That was really fantastic. Definitely another contrast in terms of our inputs this morning. So our next contribution is from Dr. Shana Cohen. She's the Director of TASK, as I mentioned, an independent think tank concerned with social change. And I'm going to hand over to Shana now to kind of give her, as I said, drawing on her research and evidence base, her perspective on our topic this morning. Thank you, Shana.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate the invitation. And for those of you who don't know me or know TASK, we're as Inez said, we're an independent think tank. We focus on 4 areas: inequality, social inclusion, climate justice, and democracy. And can you just give me a heads up if you can hear me, because my connection is not that great. But just let me know if, oh good, okay, thanks. So all of those areas, I would say, arguably contribute to social solidarity. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is kind of in between the 2 previous speakers. I agree with a lot of what they have said, particularly about the argument against austerity and thinking about how public services are managed. I've actually lived in a number of countries, and I've seen like the UK, where they rely upon the National Health Service and how important it is, and how they manage on scarce resources actually fairly effectively. and other countries where public services have been left to decline. And I can see the impact on inequality. So as Jim said, it's not just the investment, it's also how those services are managed. Anyway, I'm just going to start the presentation. As you can tell, I'm from the US, I'm from Texas. I just want to start my presentation with a quote from, it was in the New York Times, from a public health official in Texas. And if any of you follow what's happening in the US, you know that the cases are surging there, and Texas is one of the states where they're surging. And the reason is because the governor and the state government, and I won't show my politics, but it's totally Republican Party dominated. The government has insisted that they open for business. So one of the public health officials was remarking on the surge in cases, which is corresponded with opening for business. And he said, it is really a matter of bringing workers and companies to the table together to figure this out, which is the tension between opening for business and the surge in cases. It's not simply a matter of companies weighing in with the government without having people's interests represented. And he added, this public health official, that Texans used to be really great at this. And that's kind of the theme of what I want to talk about today, is how do you bring groups that represent the people's interests together with the government? And then I would add the private sector. So in that sense, they're not talking about the private sector there, but it is companies that want to get back to work so they can earn a profit and pay their employees. So what's happened is not just indicative of Ireland as well. You have SMEs in Ireland wanting to get back to work because they are going to go out of business if they don't. If you read the statistics on SMEs, a lot of them don't have enough reserves to make it through the next 6 months, which means all their employees will lose their jobs. And Jim probably knows this much better than I do, that the Irish economy is very dependent upon SMEs for employment, much more so than you would think, considering the role of the MNCs here. So taking that into account, I want to talk about 3 areas where I think the new government, whatever it looks like, should think about. And I'll just do a quote first from the program for government. Whatever happens to it, we'll know, I guess, by Saturday. The program for government states that the COVID-19 pandemic illustrated the strength and depth of community life in Ireland. The resilient solidarity that helped to withstand the pressures of the lockdown emergency was drawn from a deep community life and pride of place. So the program for government also calls for learning from this solidarity, which should serve as an article of faith in the future and what we can achieve together. So I'm just going to focus briefly on 3 areas where I think the new government, whatever its composition, should focus on in order to help. Not just, I would totally agree with Kitty. I don't like the word charity because it suggests that you should volunteer your effort to help people who are poor. It reminds me of the Victorian era in England, and I think that there is something to be said for rethinking the name and building the status of what we do. So I totally agree with Jim. We cannot go back to austerity. We have to take advantage of low interest rates, negative interest rates to borrow and to reshape the relationship between economy and society. Where I may disagree is the fact, I think you have to think about the relationship between the two, and the two in tandem. One does not exist without the other. And you can't say we need economic growth in order to build society or to build social cohesion. You have to think about the relationship between the two. And I think if we thought about the relationship between the two, we would also understand how to improve the quality of public services, because it would involve more consultation with patient groups, for health services, et cetera. So the first area that the new government has to think about is the structural imbalance in the Irish economy. I mentioned SMEs, the proportion which is above the EU average and above the OECD average, I think, of the proportion of the labor market that is reliant upon SMEs for employment. And if you think about how they're doing, then you can get a glimpse of what the unemployment rates are going to look like unless the state intervenes. So the other side of that also is we have the MNCs down by the Keys, but we also have a large number of low wage sectors like hospitality and retail. And these have been the sectors that have been the worst hit. And the government's going to have to do a rethink anyway. But as part of that rethink, the government needs to reconsider their dependence on low wage labor, which makes Ireland, which is exceptional in Ireland compared to other EU countries. If you look at other small economies or small countries like Finland, there's hospitality and tourism have a far fewer percentage of low wage workers. And that's one of the state we're in, which is our annual inequality report, talked about that. The fact that Ireland tourism relies upon a low wage workforce more than other comparable economies in the EU. And if you wave terms like the Green New Deal, or you talk about just economic growth, that doesn't mean that those people necessarily have jobs, or jobs of the quality that they had before, or jobs that will enable them to survive. So one of the things that the Program for Government mentions is Ludgate, which some of you might be familiar with. It's the digital hub in Skibbereen. And I'm mentioning it as an example because it's a community originated enterprise. It's a digital hub for young people in particular. It allows them to live in an area like Skibbereen, which has a lower cost than Dublin. What I think is interesting about Skibbereen and needs to be developed is not just to replicate digital hubs in other areas of the country, rural areas in particular, as a way to attract people outside of Dublin and create jobs, but it's also something that builds the relationship between community, local business, and local government. And that has not been articulated in the Program for Government, but I think it's going to be important moving forward in the brave new world where we live, because you have the pandemic, you have the climate crisis, which we aren't really talking about in enough depth, even though the discussion about the new government is about the Green Party. And it's talking about creating local supply chains and local jobs. And I think that is something that the new government is going to have to consider. How do you develop local economies? In order to do that, you have to integrate community representatives and community groups. They also need to favor, moving forward, companies, whether it's social enterprises or other models of worker democracy, that pay a living wage and that recognize worker rights, and that even consider worker worker shares in the company. So it's the government prioritizing or favoring those kinds of companies. So there's a sense of job security, but also fair pay, and to move away from the current model, which is too imbalanced. Now, the second area that I'd recommend that the government think about, and this is based on living for 13 years in the UK while the government imposed pretty crippling austerity. And if any of you are familiar with the situation in the UK, you know that food banks have exploded over the past decade. I mean, it's fortunate that the Church of England in some ways was ready for this, because they've set up over 400, probably more, food banks, the Trussell Trust, which is funded by the Church of England. And it shows you the demand. I can tell you from Texas, I saw a striking photo in the Guardian of 10,000 cars lined up to use a food bank in San Antonio. And they were talking about how there were Lexuses in the food line. And you could say, why don't you just go ahead and sell your car? But it's kind of complicated when you're dealing with a crippling economic recession. But it shows you that it isn't just people who are on low wage jobs who've lost their income. It's also people in higher wage jobs who need to stand in line at 4 o'clock in the morning to access food from a food bank. What I would strongly recommend for the new government is that you avoid basic needs becoming the core focus of charities. There isn't the same issue of hunger here in Ireland as there is in the US or the UK, but you do have a situation where you could next year be addressing just how can people survive? How can they make it from day to day or month to month? And you don't want charities dealing with that kind of demand, because you're going to probably be managing on scarcer resources, and you'll have soaring demand for people who are very vulnerable and marginalized and who aren't used to it. After the last recession in 2008, I was in the US, and there were people, middle class as there are now, middle class families who had never been in this situation before. And it's not, you can say, oh, I'm not going to feel sorry for them because they've had a good life. But if you suddenly lose your income and you're having to rely upon a charity to survive, it's traumatic. So you have the trauma of the pandemic, and you have the trauma of losing your job, and then you have the trauma of your status. So you don't want charities to have to deal with that kind of rawness, that to be their core focus, because it's all absorbing. You can't really think about the issues that Kitty and Inez and Deidre and Jim have all raised, because you're managing from day to day. We have a report on household debt that showed that in-work households, low-income in-work households in Ireland have the fastest rising rates of debt, and it's due to paying utility bills. It's not, they're in rental accommodation. It's not mortgage debt. It's just to survive. So if you add the pandemic and the recession on top of that, you know that those families are going to be facing a crisis of survival in the next 18 months. And I'll wrap up. The third is, as Jim mentioned, and as Kitty has mentioned, the charity sector has, if we rename it, the sector has to be a better place to work. We have another report, sorry, I keep citing our work, on the care economy, which was written by Rob Sweeney. And he said in his analysis, and the report is due out later in the summer, people who work in home care or childcare are overwhelmingly female, and that's not a surprise, and often migrant. And they receive, their pay is generally low. So what we've done is there are countries like Ireland or Sweden, where you often hear about how great their childcare provision is. But what happens is that the sector, the childcare sector, the home care sector, they reproduce gender inequality because it's women going into those jobs and they're not paid very well. So there may be jobs available for women, and you may have greater equality of labor force participation between men and women, but you have greater income inequality because the jobs that women end up doing are lower pay. So we have to avoid that also being the situation in the charity sector, which currently is the case, because if you look at like the Benefax 2020 data, people in the sector are paid less than they are in other sectors. So in order to address demand, you can't just be, okay, let's deal with the problems of the people who are beneficiaries. You also have to reward people who are doing that work, and you have to reward it better. So one is to think about pay and job security. Think about getting rid of the use of temporary contracts in the sector. And also the government should set up schemes that really encourage people to set up private foundations. Ireland is way behind other countries in terms of the level of private foundations. There are very few non-state sources of income in Ireland. If you, again, I'm going to use the UK or the US. Of course, the US is a much bigger country and the UK is a bigger country, but there are hundreds of private family foundations or corporate foundations that fund charity work, and they should fund innovation. It shouldn't just be to keep services going. It should be about innovation. Anyway, I will conclude by just saying how we're going to achieve all this. And I want to go back to what Deidre said. There has to be kind of momentum, collective momentum and shared language, but also getting behind particular policy positions and asking for greater data. The data on the sector and its impact is actually pretty fragmented. It's not good enough. So I think one of the things that the new government should do for the sector is to sponsor a lot more research. And that's not self-interested. It may sound that way, but I think it could be a lot of people participating in impact analysis of the sector and helping understand how the sector functions. Anyway, thank you. I'll stop there.
Brilliant, Shana. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. And I suppose, as promised, a little bit more drawing on the data, as well as actually Shana's own personal experience of living in different countries, which always gives us a little bit more flavour. I suppose that sometimes we think these are problems that are just in Ireland, but clearly not the case. So just before we actually hand over to the breakout rooms, there is an opportunity, I think, just to maybe go back to all the speakers, which I think we can, if we can see them all on stage, just to kind of give them maybe one last opportunity to make a comment, because now they've all heard each other's inputs, they may want to say something. I know, in fairness to Shana, she probably got that opportunity because I think she drew very heavily where she agreed or disagreed with the previous speakers, and also perhaps put a focus on this idea of getting a balance between economy and society. So maybe if that is a sort of a thematic area, we might go back to the speakers just to give a brief comment on a little bit more maybe on how to do that, because I think that was maybe a common theme coming through all of the inputs, that we're all looking for some sort of change, and that change being something that the C&V sector can benefit from, that it's some way contextualized against a rebalancing or a better balancing of society and economy, public services and their outcomes for citizens. Clearly harder to do than say. So perhaps we might just get, if we can get all of the speakers back on, we might just give them each 2 minutes to say a final point before we go out into our breakout rooms, if possible. And if not possible.
Yeah.
You want to,
here we go.
I think we go in the same order. Do you want us to go in the same order?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind, Kitty. Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I actually agreed with quite a lot of what Jim said. You'd be surprised to hear. I mean, I do agree that the economy is important. Obviously, we have to have an economy for a society to pay for itself and to survive and to live. But what I would feel is that it's how that is structured and where the balance comes down, and the situation I think that we are still living with in Ireland, and which is an overhang from the austerity, which I do hope we've learned the lessons now. We're not going to repeat that, because that was the mantra of policymakers back during the bad old days after the boom. That we invest in people, and I think that's the argument that has to be made, that the sector, the public services sector, if we want to change it from the charitable sector, because so much of what the charities do is public service, and I think that's an argument that they have to make, that they have to push forward how important they are and how important you are in terms of what you do for society and what you do to empower people to participate in society. And I suppose it's about investing in that, and it's about arguing that we must have a more equal society. And I think that's where the sector possibly has to get a bit more political, and not be so polite in its engagement, perhaps, with governments, and say, no, that this is important, this is what people want. I think that the sector has to win that public relations battle as well, and in terms of saying what we do is important, what kind of society does everyone want, and because it's the kind of society we want to push forward is an equal society, and talk not just about the work that they do, perhaps with homeless people or people fleeing domestic violence, or people who can't get access to good health services, to actually talk about the wider society issues about equality. And as Shauna said, there is an issue about pay in the sector, and I think that is an argument that has to be made to government going forward, that we are a public service, what we do is crucial, that we need to treat people as we want society to treat, but we have to treat our own employees the way we want society to be, which is a more equal, better, empowering society, and that civic participation element. Sorry, rambled a lot there, but that's can't hear you.
Okay, maybe I will come in for a couple of observations. Shan, I'm not sure how you interpret what I said, but I very much said that we needed a balance between the economy and society. I said it's not a binary choice, one has to feed into the other. So I don't differentiate between the economy and society. One is as important as the other. The simple point I was making is that without a functioning economy generating resources, you will not be able to create a society, because you won't have the money to do so. And we've seen over the last 15 years the impact that economic activity has on tax revenues. They're very, very strongly correlated. We should never forget that. After 2008, when the economy started to recover, we saw tax revenues recovering very strongly. And that's what funded social expenditure and all government expenditure. And there is a view out there that the Irish governments do not spend enough money on public expenditure. I hear Fine Gael being described as a right-wing economic party. Well, if you look at their record in terms of taxation and in terms of spending, it certainly doesn't fit the definition of right-wing, because they have expanded spending pretty aggressively over the last 3 or 4 years. Okay, what we need to do, I think, is, when you talk about quality of life and all of that, there is no coherent view on what we need. There isn't a clear view out there. We haven't identified what we want as a society, and our political system certainly does not help that process. And when you see what happened on the 8th of February, where political parties come out and make all sorts of wild promises that will never possibly be delivered, the people buy into that rubbish. Okay, so we need to sit down and have a national discourse in a serious way. And Sarkozy tried to do it in France, but probably wasn't the right person to do it, to try and identify exactly what we mean by having a high quality of life, having a society that functions. And there's no doubt about it, every economic study out there would show you that the investment in education is absolutely crucial. Reducing inequality, and investment in education obviously feeds into that, and I think it's probably one of the biggest enablers of reducing inequality. But we've got to have this national discourse about how you eliminate or certainly reduce inequality. And until you do that, until we identify what we really want as a society, we're going nowhere. We're all over the place. And I suppose in terms of your sector and in the whole fundraising issue, as an outsider looking in, it strikes me that there are way too many organizations. It seems to be incredibly fractured. And I don't watch the Late Late Show, never did, never will. But I do believe that during the COVID-19 process, that there was a fundraiser done for charities every night, for big charities that soaked up resources from the rest. So, there does need to be, I think, a centralized mechanism for funding all charities. But obviously, to do that, you need, sorry, I use the word charities, okay, and I know you don't like that word, but I'm a dinosaur, so I'll use it for another minute or so. But we do need to have a centralized funding mechanism. But obviously, to do that, if you're going to use taxpayers' resources, you need to make sure that the funding is put into structures that actually work. So that's it.
Great, thank you, and apologies. I was muted in my last segue for Kitty, so apologies for that. So this will be an even quicker segue. Just back to Shana very quickly, 2 minutes, Shana, just before we go into the breakout groups.
Thanks. So just to follow up with Jim, so I think that it's the relationship between economy and society that has to be articulated better. I did get your point that it's not, but you're talking about growth and resources available through taxation. Actually, I think there needs to be a lot of thinking now, and that includes representatives of communities providing input about the kind of economy we want. It's not going to be the same kind of economy we had. There's going to be a different economic structure going forward, partly because some of the sectors like tourism and hospitality are in bad shape, and it's not clear how and when they're going to recover. So I think that the community, the sector, has a role to play in the kinds of like local businesses that they would like to fund, that provide a sense of community sustainability, that help charities work. I'm going to use that word too. So I think there needs to be more thinking about it. Just to finish on something, there's a campaign going on in the UK, and it's a political campaign, but it's called Build Back Better. So I'm not going to forget about the politics. I like the term, and maybe there's something to be said about the charities working together on a campaign with a slogan about the kind of society that they want. That kind of vision has to come from us, and we shouldn't wait for the state to give it to us. And I'll just conclude there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was really fantastic. I'm really appreciative of your contributions, your efforts. I think that's been really stimulating. I've loads of questions myself already. So I'm very much hopeful that we've set the scene and provided a context for the breakout rooms to go off and have a good old Barney about what they've heard, what they think, what they disagree with, what they support. And I suppose maybe at the end, that challenge from Shana about can the sector itself build that campaign, and what role perhaps maybe would the wheel play in something like that. So I understand I'm handing over to Sinead now, who's going to